Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this webinar. This webinar is organized by the Electoral Commissions Forum of SADC countries and International IDEA, and the purpose is to review the recently conducted rerun elections in Malawi, and also to look at issues around electoral justice in the Southern Africa region, considering the recent judgments in South Africa and Malawi. We are very pleased to have representatives of the electoral commissions from the region. To save time, we would not have time to have everyone introduce themselves, but I will just go ahead and recognize the electoral commissions that are represented here. We have Angola, we have Botswana, Eswatini, Lesotho, Malawi, Mauritius, Mozambique, Namibia, South Africa, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and we also have a representative from the SADC Electoral Advisory Council with us. We also recognize our partners like ISA and participants from and other participants that registered to join this webinar, like from the EODS and other organizations. You're very much welcome to this webinar. Without much ado, we will start with the opening remarks. Just in terms of quick housekeeping, you can use the chat function if you have questions, technical questions. You can use the operators tab, but for participants, you can use the participants tab. And if you want to message people privately, you can do so. If you do not need to speak, please do not click the request to speak button, except for the panelists now. And when we get to the discussion session, we can have people who need to speak use the request to speak button. Without much ado, I would invite Professor Adebayo Olukoshi, who is the Director for Africa and West Asia at International IDEA, to give his opening remarks. You're welcome, Prof.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Olufunto. Thank you to you and to the Secretariat of the ECF-SADC for this initiative, and also the invitation extended to me to say a few words. I'd like to recognize the chair and leadership of the ECF-SADC, Advocate Nothemba Chipuya, chair of the Election Commission of Namibia, and her team, as well as the representatives, including heads in some cases of the various election commissions participating in this conversation. I think it's something delightful to engage in this retrospective stock-taking exercise of looking at the lessons from Malawi's recent electoral experience, beginning with the elections which were cancelled effectively by the Supreme Court, the role of the judiciary in setting up a rerun, and the operationalization of the rerun itself. When the judgment was given from Malawi, it came almost like a thunderbolt on the electoral scene across the African continent. Partly because I think most people, myself included, did not really imagine first that there was that extent of judicial independence, let alone audacity, in the context of the way in which executive authority had been exercised in Malawi up to that point. And coming after the experience which was registered in Kenya, when a rerun was also ordered by the Supreme Court of Kenya with regard to the last elections in that country. It seems to raise, at least for many of those who are not specialists in the field, a major issue about the role of the judiciary in electoral governance on our continent. A question which I would argue has actually been on the radar and been played out perhaps less dramatically than in Kenya and in Malawi, but nevertheless present in other contexts where the judiciary has intervened in order to compel either a rerun, albeit not at the presidential level, in elections held in some districts or with regard to some localities, or indeed being the decisive force in pronouncing on the final outcome of the vote, as happened, for example, in the closely contested elections in Ghana, where the difference between John Mahama and Nana Akufo-Addo was counted in the thousands, as opposed to the wide margin that is often the case in a lot of elections. So quite clearly, something is shifting on the continent with regard to the important role and place of the judiciary and what this might mean for long-term electoral governance on the continent, and the luxury of assuming that all of our energies could be invested solely in the mechanics of the elections without adequate attention to what some have now described in the literature as a growing judicialization of electoral politics, is one which we can no longer afford, and we need to pay attention much more closely to the role and place of the judiciary as also an umpire in the electoral process, over and above the electoral commissions themselves that are constitutionally appointed as the primary umpires of the electoral contest. So therefore, the Malawi experience, much discussed in recent times, offers an opportunity for a wide-ranging reflection, but also for lessons learned, particularly in places where the electoral contest is keen and where the prospects for a recourse to a judicial interpretation seems to be high. And I hope that out of the presentation which we'll be hearing from Mr. Sam Alfandika, the Chief Election Officer of Malawi, and the commentaries that will follow, we'll be able to tease out a number of useful conclusions, which will become part of the repertoire of policy lessons that we can take forward in order to prepare ourselves for such eventualities in the future and not be taken by surprise. I look forward to the conversation, and I thank the Secretariat of the ECF-SADC again for the initiative, as well as my colleagues in IDEA, Olufunto, and others for also accompanying the process alongside other partners such as AISA that was referred to earlier on. Thank you, and wishing us all a fruitful deliberation.
Many thanks, Prof. I think Prof has already raised, a good number of issues for us to start considering, and I can't wait for us to get into the meat of the discussions. But of course, this meeting would not have been made possible without the decision of the SADC ECF Executive Committee that, considered it quite important that the elections in Malawi should be reviewed. So I would give the floor now to the chairperson of the the ECF-SADC Executive Committee, Advocate Nothemba Chipuya. You're welcome, ma'am.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Prof. Adebayo, for giving us that insightful introduction to this webinar. You always have a lot of very insightful and inspiring messages to start off our debates always. So thank you very much. We appreciate it. And I wish to take this opportunity to welcome all member commissions and to appreciate that we've all made it possible to attend this webinar despite our busy schedules in our respective countries. In particular, I wish to welcome the chairperson of the Malawi Electoral Commission, Honorable Justice Kachale, whom we have not yet met physically, but have communicated with him several times on forum matters. We look forward to meeting him in future as he participates in our network with fellow chairpersons of electoral commissions. Our distinguished speakers from Democracy Works Foundation and the University of Malawi, we welcome you and appreciate your commitment to the work that we do at ECF-SADC and for also offering your expertise at this important meeting. I also wish to recognize the presence of SEAC, who have also joined our webinar, and we acknowledge our long history of collaboration with the ECF that we have with SEAC and our numerous collaboration on numerous observer missions in SADC and on the continent. I'm aware that we have been participating in a number of webinar meetings organized by our partner organizations, including the AU, the UNDP, the Arab EMBs, the SADC Parliamentary Forum, Democracy Works Foundation, Civil Society Forum, and other non-state actors. I wish to acknowledge our active participation in these platforms as they continue to inform us and connect us with the rest of the continent. Allow me to appreciate the fact that our collaboration with International IDEA is growing stronger by the day as we continue to organize these virtual meetings on thematic electoral areas that we have both identified as needing attention. I'm pleased to share that IDEA has made it possible and provided the logistics for the use of other SADC languages at this meeting. Thank you very much, Prof. Adebayo, and your team for this great gesture and support. Allow me to indicate that this time around, we will not be getting updates from Seychelles and Tanzania on their readiness to conduct elections on the 24th of October and the 28th of October 2020, respectively, as we are advised that the two commissions are very busy in the middle of key electoral processes, such as nominations. We shall be communicating to our member commissions on the position of the forum in relation to election observation in these elections. Colleagues, this meeting is held in line with the EXCO resolution of 24th June 2020, which mandated that Malawi Electoral Commission be given the platform to share its experiences and lessons learned during the fresh presidential elections of the 23rd June 2020. This meeting is organized to facilitate conversations on the perspectives on the role of the judiciary in elections, particularly in view of the recent judgments in Malawi and South Africa. These exchanges will allow EMBs and other stakeholders to draw lessons from the recent elections in Malawi, and we hope that lessons learned on operational aspects and the specific impact of COVID and the implications on the overall cost of elections. These discussions will form the basis of the advisory memo to inform the ECF-SADC 22nd Annual General Conference deliberations on EMB matters and related matters befitting guidelines and policies. As I conclude my remarks, let me emphasize that this is a valuable opportunity for us as electoral management bodies to learn and interrogate the issues at hand, in particular the lessons on electoral justice. I think Prof has elaborated a lot on this area, and we really look forward to taking the opportunity to take a leaf or two from eminent experts presenting to us today, and I wish you all fruitful deliberation. Given these few remarks, I hand over to our meeting facilitator to guide us further. Thank you so much, Olufunke.
Thank you, Advocate Notemba. Very, very much appreciated. We continue to appreciate our partnership with the ECF. Before I hand over to the lady that makes the magic happen, just a quick reminder again about how the platform works. Everyone is on as long as you have signed in. You do not need to use the request to speak button, except if you're a panelist and it's time for you to speak. I also want to mention that we have Portuguese translation available for our guests from Angola and Mozambique. You can access that using the button on the left bottom of the screen where you have floor, and then if you click that, you will see Portuguese, you see English, and you can select the appropriate language. So that said, I would like to hand over to the Executive Secretary of the ECF Secretariat. And like I said, she's the lady that makes the magic happen. Hilda, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Olufunto. At some point, I'll switch off my camera so that the audio is very clear. Nonetheless, good morning, honorable members. Allow me to say all protocol observed. I take that Olufunto as the moderator and the EXCO chairperson have already given the background to the meeting. They've talked about the EXCO resolution of June 23rd. So I will briefly just take you through the program, which basically has three parts. I'm glad that we have already gone through the first part, which is the opening session. Then the next session, the second part, is our main session, which basically looks at lessons learned and perspectives. We will have experts. Particularly, we have deliberately gotten experts from Malawi because they are home. They know exactly what is happening. We would have loved to get a judge from the SADC region, but unfortunately, he's not available at this point. We will get an update from Malawi, from the chairperson, and then from the CEO Malawi on the impact of COVID-19 on the lessons learned. Allow me, moderator, to indicate that our program has changed slightly to allow South Africa to come in just after the chairperson of Malawi Electoral Commission, as IEC South Africa has indicated that the speaker has another engagement. And so we will give the CEO of South Africa 10 minutes just to give an overview on lessons learned on electoral justice in the case of IEC South Africa. That is a small correction on the program. Then we have the third session, which is an open one for discussion, where we will allow interventions and general comments by members. But to start this session, we have included a member of the SADC Electoral Advisory Council just to give a takeaway remarks for only 5 minutes. Then the rest of the commissions can then come in to freely make input on the various perspectives. The wrap-up session, which I will spearhead, will re-emphasize key issues. We will single out actionable items, and we will set the tone for moving forward. In this regard, I want to emphasize that the takeaways will reach the 22nd Annual General Conference, which will take place the first week of December. And now that I mentioned the AGC, allow me, moderator, to indicate that actually one of our speakers today, Dr. Augustine, I want to remind members that he was the seminar facilitator when Malawi hosted us last year at the 21st AGC. And I want to emphasize that this is the beginning of a good working relationship with Democracy Works. We are grateful that he has accepted our invitation, and we look forward to future engagements with the organization and him directly. With those few remarks, moderator, I think my assignment ends there. Thank you very much.
Moderator, I think the moderator is speaking to a muted mic.
Unmute, yeah. Unmute your mic.
Forgive me. I didn't notice that. And the good news is I was looking for Augustine, so I found him. So you didn't miss anything I said. But yeah, we are going into the main session. And as already mentioned by Hilda, in this session we'll be listening to different speakers. I'll take the time to already just introduce everyone, and so that we don't, have to do separate introductions. So I'll start with the first two. When we are done with that, then I'll introduce the next two. So for the first session, where we're looking at the political context and the operational aspects of the elections in Malawi, we have Dr. Augustine Maguluwondo, who is the the chief of party of Democracy Works Foundation. And I think Hilda has already spoken about him extensively. He previously used to be at the Netherlands Institute for Multi-Party Democracy as the Africa Regional Representative. So he is a very, very vast expert in the field of democracy and elections on the continent and specifically in Malawi. So we are very pleased to have Augustine with us. And after him, we'll listen to Mr. Sam Alfandika, who is the Chief Electoral Officer of the Malawi Electoral Commission. I have listened to him on quite a number of webinars, and I must say his presentations are quite insightful and impressive for us to understand more how the Electoral Commission navigated that space in Malawi. So without much ado, I will hand over to Augustine. You have 10 minutes, and same for Sam, 10 minutes as well. And after your interventions, I will introduce the next set of speakers. May I ask, because I can't see on my screen, for Justice Kachale to press the request to speak button, for Sai to also do the same, and for Dr. Sundu to do the same, so that we admit them to the floor already and we have them on. Axel, I hope we have not exceeded the number of people that need to be on the floor. Okay, so I think we have everybody that is speaking in the next panel.
Yeah, we are fine. Ulu, we are fine.
Super, thanks, Vito. Okay, so please keep your mic mute, except you're the speaker. Augustine, you have the floor. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Olufuntu, and thank you also the chair of SADC ECF, the executive secretary, and the Africa director of International IDEA. I think allow me, before I go into my brief presentation, to really express my profound gratitude on behalf of Democracy Works Foundation for according me and the organization this opportunity to partner with you in this very important initiative. As Democracy Works Foundation, and as already Hilda has alluded to, we are working in Southern Africa region. We primarily are working with political parties and increasingly also with civil society and electoral management bodies in the SADC region. And we see our role really as one of the players that wishes to contribute to the building of resilient and inclusive democracies, including, of course, contributing to inclusive electoral processes. So for me, this invitation was just not an invitation to me, the person, but indeed an invitation to the institution for which we don't take for granted. As already indicated, the focus of my presentation is to provide the political context within which the fresh presidential elections of June 2020 were held in Malawi. In so doing, I'll be speaking to some of the critical issues that shaped that particular context and some of the questions that had to be dealt with, some of the dilemmas that those managing elections had to face and had to deal with, and most importantly, some of the key lessons from a political point of view. Maybe before we speak to that particular context, let me just take one step backward to look at where the elections of 2020 were coming from. As already indicated by Professor Adebayo and also by the moderator, the fresh presidential elections of 2020 were necessitated by the nullification of the presidential election results of May 2019. Important to note is that the elections of May 2019 were actually the sixth in a series to be held since the reintroduction of multi-party politics in Malawi. And which means, essentially, from an institutional point of view, these elections were held in a context where electoral politics and electoral administration and electoral management had become quite institutionalized in the various institutions that are related to elections and election management. Which means this was not the first time that the Electoral Commission of Malawi was holding these elections. It was not the first time that political parties in Malawi were participating, and neither was it the first time that the various public institutions, government agencies were participating, and of course not the first time that the judiciary ended up being involved in the determination of elections and election results. I think in this particular context, therefore, there were elections that were held in a context of enormous experiences by various stakeholders. So experience was not really the big issue here. And maybe the most important issue to highlight is that what shaped really the landscape of these elections was the contestation revolving around the nullification of the 2019 elections. And I think many of us by now are very familiar with the fact that those elections, the presidential election results of 2019, were nullified largely on the basis of the massive irregularities that the courts had established in what became to be dubbed as the TPEX elections. Because particularly the major issue really was the use of correction fluid. And immediately after the nullification, maybe before the nullification, it's also important to get back to the contestation around the results of those elections. Yes, there was the use of TPEX, but it's also important to recall that these elections, the results of these elections reflected a very narrow margin. The 2019 elections reflected a very narrow margin between the winner then, President Peter Mutharika, and the fallout. So the winner had won those elections with 38.57%, and the fallout had lost those elections with 35.41%, leaving a margin of roughly around 2%. So there was a very narrow margin between the one who won and the one who lost. In other words, again, there were elections that demonstrated one of the key challenges that you face with simple majoritarian electoral systems. So there were elections that challenged the electoral system, if one wants to refer to that. The aftermath of the 2019 elections, as I said, were highly controversial. And as we know, the opposition leaders, particularly led by Lazarus Chakwera and Saulos Lima, disputed those elections and they presented the matter to courts. And subsequently, there were nationwide protests, basically led by a grouping of civil society actors under the banner of the Human Rights Defenders. And in that particular period, there were a number of issues that need to be taken into account insofar as the political context is informed. One particular issue was that the period between 2019 and 2020 was largely characterized by the crisis of legitimacy of the executive that was in place then. Because the election results were being disputed in court, it also meant that the administration that was in place then was actually being questioned. Its legitimacy was at stake. So one key feature of the political context was the crisis of legitimacy in the executive, in which case you were facing a situation where the administration's political legitimacy particularly was basically being questioned, and the protests, of course, were a testimony to that. The second key feature that we see in this particular context is indeed the high levels of polarization and confrontation between and among key institutions that otherwise need to be operating in harmony if you are preparing for elections. Let's single out a few of those. In elections, you would want to ensure that you have an electoral management body that is in charge and that has the confidence and trust of the electoral stakeholders. Following the nullification, of course, one of the challenges that the electoral management body in Malawi faced was exactly that. So the electoral management body also had lost legitimacy, had lost the trust and confidence of the majority of stakeholders, particularly, of course, those that had taken the matter to court. In other words, therefore, it was a context where the entire electoral management body, was on trial insofar as its capacity, its ability, and basically its trust in managing elections was concerned. On the other hand, you had also the key players in the electoral process, the political parties themselves divided. You had the opposition political parties that had taken the matter to court, facing the then governing party that, of course, was defending the results of 2019. And in this particular regard, therefore, the electoral management body had to deal with key stakeholders, particularly the political parties, that they themselves were completely divided. You therefore had political parties that were not just contesting in an electoral process, but they themselves had so much to settle between and among them. So elections then were seen also as not just the process that is a constitutional right of everyone to participate and decide on the future of their country, but they were also seen as a solution insofar as political settlement is concerned. So there was so much at stake in that particular regard. The other aspect is to look at the role of the executive in electoral processes. We know that elections need to have the support of the public institutions, particularly the government of the day, who then, of course, have to provide the necessary support in terms of funding, in terms of technical support, among others, because elections are organized largely with the support of the public infrastructure, if you so wish. In this particular case, you had an election and electoral process that did not have a full buy-in and endorsement of the executive, because the administration was, at that particular point, contesting and defending, the results of 2019. This meant that the electoral management body then, also was increasingly being isolated. I think another key feature in this particular political context is to look at the role of civil society. You had an electoral process that was held amidst or in the context where the levels of civic activism had increased. And as I said earlier on, there were regular protests under the banner of the human rights defenders. And therefore, it was also a context that demonstrated the depth of civic activism in a country, meaning that it also meant the key stakeholders involved had to deal with, a great sense of activism to a point that actually would make the management of the electoral process difficult, particularly when you had a campaign by civil society calling for the resignation of the chairperson of the Electoral Commission, and a commission that at the same time needed to respond to the court decision, thereby creating a conundrum, if not a dilemma. On the one hand, the court's nullification of the 2019 elections meant that there was need to have an electoral management body that should then prepare and organize the subsequent rerun, if at all. On the other hand, you had this level of civic activism, of course, compounded by also the court process, which basically meant that the electoral management body could not have the space and the ability to really focus on this process. So you had this level of polarization and confrontation of key stakeholders. So the whole process, therefore, was very much conflictual in nature, thereby presenting a huge challenge, particularly also to the electorate, who then were faced with an electoral process where they had to basically address and reflect on key issues. Was this an electoral process to which they would say our aspirations are going to be secured? Was this an electoral process that essentially was basically a battle and a war between key stakeholders, particularly the elite level? So was this an elite level political settlement at play of which the citizens were not particularly part of? Was this the kind of electoral process that essentially also was testing the level of institutionalization of key democratic institutions? The other aspect, I think, that needed to be pointed out from a political point of view here is basically the judiciary and the role of the judiciary itself. And of course, I know that this is the main focus of this particular panel. From a political point of view, we saw an electoral process that demonstrated the extent to which the judiciary, is involved in electoral politics. So there's the so-called judicialization of electoral processes. Of course, at the same time, there was the politicization, basically also of the judiciary itself, by which I mean we saw in this particular context the attempts by the executive to rather, meddle with the judiciary, particularly for the sole reasons of wanting to stifle, if not dampen, if not completely, block the electoral process. So there was, on the one hand, the judicialization of electoral politics and electoral processes. On the other hand, you had the politicization of the judiciary, as it were. Another key issue to look into, which is one of the features and challenges of electoral processes in Africa, was here, the role of development partners, which is something that I think need to be looked into carefully. The 2019 elections were partially supported by various international development partners, who, of course, also put in a framework which is called a basket fund. The nullification of the 2019 elections indirectly challenged, if not questioned, the kind of role that development partners played. By this, for instance, I mean, you had international election observer missions that had already passed their judgment on the outcome of the election that later on would be nullified. The question therefore became, in the context of Malawi, what role do international election observer missions play? And I think in this particular regard, you would see that the outcome or the nullification itself presented a huge dilemma to development partners who had to take a decision as to whether to accept the fact that these elections were nullified and that a rerun would be called for, and that they would have to think as to what kind of support they provided. So for a period, you could see the reluctance of development partners. In a way, from a political economy point of view, one would argue it was in a dilemma that basically was presenting to them a question, what role did we play and what role can we play? Thereby raising a fundamental question in electoral politics in Africa, what role must development partners play? I think moving on, we saw the role of parliament in electoral politics too. The nullification required certain legal reforms to be undertaken if the next elections to be held could be held with the necessary legal framework, the supportive legal framework. And again, here was parliament that, of course, was an outcome of the 2019 elections, which had been nullified, and which was comprising of also members of parliament that were coming from, some of them, from the party that was defending the results. So the electoral politics that we could see elsewhere found themselves also in Parliament, in which case we saw a situation where within Parliament, it was very difficult to generate a consensus that would lead to passing of necessary legislation, which again is one major challenge. And as I conclude, I think one of the political features of this was, again, the pandemic that followed as the preparations for the elections were at the peak. This is the COVID pandemic, which basically became also a political issue. The politicization of the pandemic meant that the electoral process could not just be held in an environment that would guarantee the active participation and also a credible process. In this particular case, we saw a situation whereby the calls by the administration to lock down in the name of the pandemic was perceived as a lockdown on democracy itself, thereby challenging the legitimacy of the administration. I think finally, if I were to summarize key issues that require further reflection here with regard to the process leading to elections of 2020 and particularly the political context. Yes. So in wrapping up, two issues I think call for further reflection here. One is how far can the judiciary go insofar as determining the electoral outcomes is concerned and challenging the electoral management bodies in this particular regard. Secondly, what role can international development partners play? And I think thirdly, in my view, the resilience of electoral management bodies here is one key issue that one has to look at. I think the case of Malawi was such that had the entire electoral management body resigned and stopped preparations for elections, would the elections be held on time when finally everything was put in place? And I think finally also the role of leadership, because we saw subsequently that within the same difficult environment with the change in leadership at the EMB level, it was possible to pull this through, which speaks to really the role of institutions and their leaders in Africa, which goes beyond just the necessity of legal frameworks. I can speak on and on, but I know that my time is up and I don't want to annoy my able moderator. I want to give her a good job and make life easier for her. Thank you very much. I'm available to further reflect by way of questions that might follow. And I look forward to a very interesting conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Augustine. You have actually raised a good number of issues, and I believe without having to summarize some of those issues, I believe Dr. Mandise will talk about, how far the judiciary can go. He would address some of those issues. We'll hear more from the electoral commission.
We don't seem to have Olufunto.
I'm right here.
No, Olufunto, we hear you very well.
Okay.
Hello.
Hilda, can you hear?
This is Hilda. I'm just trying
to
hear. Yes. I'm trying to locate Olufunto, the moderator.
I'm right here. Can you hear me?
Hello.
Olufunto is here, Hilda. Olufunto, can you carry on?
Okay. Yeah, that's fine. So without taking more time, I would like to call on the CEO of the Malawi Electoral Commission, Sami Afandika, to tell us, to give us more perspectives from the operational side of things.
Hello?
Yes, Hilda.
Hello, Wisa?
Hilda, we hear you very well. Hilda,
Hello?
we hear you very well, and we can see you.
It says Olufunto has a network. Olufunto has a network error.
No, it must be from your side, but Olufunto is well here. We can see her and hear her. So if you can refresh your page, okay. Hilda, so Olufunto can carry on.
Okay, sorry about that. Many joys of technology. But Sami, please proceed with your intervention. It's also 10 minutes. Augustine went well over time. So we hope you would help us manage the time better.
Thank you very much, Alfonso. Good morning.
Morning.
To you all, let me recognize Professor Adebayo and the ECF-SADC Executive Committee Chair, Advocate Notemba Chipuya, my Chairman and ECF-SADC President, Dr. Justice Dr. Chikundo Kachari, the ES for SADC ECF, all chairpersons and CEOs listening in to this webinar. Let me say Augustine has covered quite a number of areas which I wanted to cover as well. So I'll make sure that I should buy time by not repeating what Augustine has already said. So I'll just give a highlight of the presentation that I've submitted, which I believe will be shared to all participants. And that way we should be able to gain some ground. I wanted to highlight one key aspect of this fresh presidential election, that to us as an electoral management body, we focused much on the directives of the court judgments. So there were a number of key directives that came out of the judgment that the Electoral Commission had to look at to ensure that the mistakes of 2019 should not be repeated in the fresh presidential election in 2020. The first one was to do with the voters register. The directive said it should be the same voters register that was used in 2019. And then there was also a directive to say determination of results must be from records received from all polling stations and districts. You recall, for those of you who are following closely the election process in Malawi, we determined the election results in 2019 based on records received from the constituency tally centers, which was an administrative arrangement that was aimed at enhancing the credibility of the electoral process. But eventually it was faulted by the courts because it was never legalized before the elections took place. The other directive that took shape was to do with the election forms. There were quite a number of election forms that were modified again to enhance the credibility of the electoral process, but these were not legalized and they were unlawfully used during the 2019 elections. So as an electoral commission, we had to go back, looked at all the forms that are used during the elections and ensure that they are modified or redesigned to agree with the current rules. The other thing that we looked at as an electoral commission is the directive or the determination that the winner of the presidential election should be based on 50% plus 1 votes. As you recall, in the previous elections, it was first past the post. We used simple majority to determine the winner. So we took this into account. The most important thing was to do with the date of election, which was really a problem because first, the Electoral Commission had set the date of election based on the 150th day as ordered by the High Court, sitting as the Constitutional Court. But later on, the Supreme Court of Appeal made a clarification on the date of election to say it should be first determined by the National Assembly, which is Parliament, and then the elections should take place on the understanding that the winner should be declared before the expiry of the 150 days. So that changed the date of election from the 2nd July that was set by the Commission to 23rd June 2020. So quite a number of things also changed because of the ruling of the Supreme Court of Appeal. First, to do with the voter registration process, where the Supreme Court of Appeal, as I said earlier on, had said that the winner or the voters that voted in the 2019 elections should be the same voters. That should determine the outcome of the election in 2020. And the other thing that came out of the Supreme Court judgment was to do with who should contest in this election. The Supreme Court judgment made it clear that only those who had contested in 2019 elections should be the ones contesting in the rerun. So basing on those directives from the courts, the Electoral Commission had to conduct its activities following those directives. So with regard to the candidates, only those who had contested were allowed to contest. Likely, those who had submitted their nomination papers had contested previously, so it was not an issue regarding who should participate. Just to highlight quite a number of issues regarding the technicalities of the conduct of the election, first to do with the printing of ballot papers. As has been highlighted by the key openers of this webinar, we were implementing this electoral process under the COVID-19 environment. And this had affected the way we conducted business previously. One, to do with the printing. Instead of going to monitor the printing by the commission as well as the political parties, this was not the case. So the printing was done without any monitoring at all. But to ensure that there is buy-in from political parties, the commission had to meet the representatives or the party presidents to highlight this issue and ensure that they agree to the arrangement so that the election should go on. To ensure credibility of our voters register, we had to conduct the inspection of the voters register after the transfers. And this was very important because it confirmed to the nation that the voters register that was being used is indeed the same one that was used in 2019. The other issue that was probably a bone of contention was to do with the campaigning during the COVID-19 environment. It was an issue for political parties to adhere to the preventive measures that had been set by government then to ensure that the COVID-19 pandemic is not spread because of the political activity. There was no regard to wearing of masks in the mass rallies, and the political parties, all of them, use the traditional means of campaigning, gathering people together, thousands of them, do their campaigns, and then that was really a threat in terms of conducting an election under the COVID-19 environment. On the other hand, the Electoral Commission had ensured that whatever activities were going on, which were pioneered or championed by the Electoral Commission, had to adhere to the preventive measures which were set by government. So face masks were used, hand sanitizers, hand wash soap. That in itself had helped the commission to conduct the process while adhering or while at the same time considering the fact that there was COVID-19 in the country. With regard to perhaps challenges that were there during the implementation of the electoral process, let me highlight a few of them which were already highlighted by Augustine, some of them. First was to do with the change of the commission. The commission that started implementing this process had its tenure of office expire on 5th June, and the new commission came in on 7th June. That was a big challenge to change the leadership while the process was going on. Like enough, most of the activities had been implemented. before the previous commission left, and the new commission came in, took over from where the previous commission left, and everything went on smoothly. As I said already, there were it was uncertain in terms of the polling date, but eventually after Parliament had said 23rd June as a polling date, the Commission went ahead to adjust its programs and had polls conducted on 23rd June. The other one is what I had already said regarding the COVID-19. COVID-19 was a challenge, but it was a situation where the whole country had realized that the electoral process was the only way of resolving the political impasse that was in Malawi, and everybody wanted this election to take place. So we had to go on with COVID-19 amongst us. The last one was lack of political will in terms of funding this electoral process on the part of executive. This was a big challenge, and the commission had to go down on its knees to ensure that the funds were released, and they were released last minute to implement the most important parts of the electoral process, mostly the polling process and results management. Looking at perhaps the lessons learned from this in terms of best practices, I should highlight a few. First is to do with the high-level consultations that the Commission made to deal with key issues that were kind of potential to some kind of arguments or dissatisfaction from the political side. The other best practice was to do with the adherence to the electoral law to the letter. This was very important because we are coming from a background of not following some of the electoral laws, and then we had to ensure that the electoral laws are followed to the letter. The other best practice that I should highlight is the strong checks and balances that were attributed to this electoral process. There was quite a number of checks and balances from civil society, political parties, the electoral commission itself, to ensure that no rigging takes place, no irregularities take place, and this helped to ensure a credible process. The other issue that I wanted to highlight is to do with the process that was implemented under tight security. There was tight security. The Malawi Defense Force, Malawi Police Service were deployed, and because of that tight security, the electoral process was not disrupted. I think these are some of the issues that were characterized by the fresh presidential election. Suffice to say that at the end of it all, there was satisfaction in terms of the way the fresh presidential election was conducted. So far, we haven't had any challenges in terms of any party, any contestant going to court to contest against the outcome of the election. And most importantly, the election was conducted in a very peaceful environment, despite the background that it was a court-ordered election with disputes, but the peaceful conduct of the electoral process helped out in terms of coming up with a credible result at the end of the electoral process. Thank you very much. These are the issues I wanted to highlight, and if anything, questions will clarify some of the areas that have been touched. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sam. You've raised, issues that cut across the questions around the content of the court judgment, and then, operational issues from the side of MEC having to put together an election within such a very, very short time frame, and also complying with the court's order. With your permission, Chairperson, I'm informed that IEC South Africa has an engagement at 12:30, and I'm wondering if it will be allowed to have the IEC South Africa to speak before the chairperson of MEC and Dr. Madisa. So it just means we take a pause from talking about Malawi for a second, come over to South Africa, and would return to issues of electoral justice in Malawi. Chairperson, I hope this is fine. The chairperson's camera is off, but Hilda, can I proceed that way to have the IEC South Africa speak now to enable them leave for their engagement? Okay.
I think that was the initial. Yes, thank you.
Sure.
You go ahead.
So we have the CEO of the IEC South Africa, Mr. Sai Mamabolo. He's with us and he'll be speaking on behalf of the Commission. He'll be also speaking on issues of electoral justice based on the recent Constitutional Court judgment in South Africa. The IEC also has standing orders, although they have 24 months to comply with those with the court judgment. Sai, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Olufonto. I direct acknowledgements to Dr. Adebayo from International Ideas, chairperson of SADC ECF, Advocate Chipua, as well as the chairperson of Malawi Electoral Commission, Dr. Kechele. I'm going to be presenting on the recent outcome of the Constitutional Court judgment that pertains to the electoral system in use in national and provincial elections. So we're not dealing with the total structure of electoral justice, and we understand that to mean processes and making it available to vindicate the rights of electoral actors. So we're not dealing with the totality thereof. We're just dealing with the narrow issue of the outcome of the Constitutional Court judgment. I'm trying to share a screen with yourselves.
Are you succeeding, Sai?
Not quite, but
okay. May I help you if you want?
I beg your pardon?
Do you need any help? Maybe I can orient you to the bottom shared screen, but first of all, open your presentation, please.
It's opened.
It's open. Leave it open on your computer screen. Then press the bottom share screen at the top right of your screen. Kudu platform at the top right.
Okay.
Have you seen the bottom share screen?
Yes.
Okay, so now you have the option, your entire screen or application window. Please use application window, so you will, and then press on the screen where the presentation is open, please. Is it okay? Okay, share screen. Have you pressed the bottom share screen?
Yes, ma'am. Let's see.
Okay, when you press the bottom share screen, you will have a box where it's mentioned your entire screen, then application window, then Chrome tab. Have you seen these three options?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, please click on application window.
Yes.
Okay, can you see your presentation? You should have many windows open. Can you see it? No. Okay.
I don't. I think we're losing time. I think let's get into the issue.
You can email it to us and we'll just upload it in the documents panel so everybody would have it.
Okay.
Good. Please proceed.
So the matter that we're about related to the Concord judgment on the electoral system. And the background is as follows. The matter was first heard in the High Court of South Africa, the Western Cape Division. And before the High Court, the matter was crisply a challenge by joint applicants that the Electoral Act is unconstitutional in limiting rights conferred by Section 19(3)(b) of the Constitution to stand for public office and, if elected, to hold such office. And further, that the limitation infringed on the right to freedom of association, which is guaranteed in terms of Section 18 of the South African Constitution. So the state parties won the matter in the High Court, and the state parties, there was the Electoral Commission, the Minister of Home Affairs, Parliament, and the President. Vindicating the state parties, the High Court said the following things. Firstly, that Section 19(3)(b) of the Constitution, which provides for every citizen to stand for office and, if elected, to hold such office. It says that does not expressly provide that standing for office must include standing as an independent candidate as opposed to a member of a political party. So the issue really was that the right in Section 19(3)(b) to stand for office and to hold office did not include standing as an independent. So that's the first point that the High Court made. And the High Court further found that other provisions of the Constitution point away from an interpretation contended for by applicants. In other words, taking the Constitution as a whole, it has an impulse of multipartism throughout and little about the right of independent candidates to stand. Section 1D of the Constitution, which is our founding provision, provides that South Africa, the Republic of South Africa, is one sovereign democratic state founded on the following values. And indeed says universal adult suffrage, national common voters roll, elections, and a multi-party system of democratic government to ensure accountability, responsiveness, and openness. So the High Court found that 1D of the Constitution, in fact, entrenches a party system, and again does not speak to individual participation of independence. And that Section 46(1)(a) and 105 1A, accord Parliament discretion to prescribe through national legislation an electoral system to apply to national and provincial legislature. And that the Constitution does not prohibit a system that makes it possible for independents to stand for public office, but it does not require that system. So I think this is a very important point. I think the High Court said that although a system that includes independence is not necessarily unlawful, but it was not a requirement. So Parliament may use it if they wanted to, but it's not a requirement. So it's not something that it's a must that Parliament had to adopt. Now, the matter was then taken directly to the Constitutional Court, which is the apex court in the Republic. And the applicants sought leave to appeal the decision of the High Court. And they sought to invalidate Section 57, capital A, and Schedule 1A to the Electoral Act. And the appeal really was an attack to declare unconstitutional certain parts of the Electoral Act to the extent that it allows individuals to be elected to the National Assembly and provincial legislatures only through membership of political parties. So this appeal was lodged just on the eve of the elections last year, on the 2nd of May last year, and the elections were on the 8th of May. So initially, the Concord postponed the matter to be heard in August last year. So they allowed the elections to proceed on the basis of the extant electoral system, and then the matter was fully ventilated in August last year, well after the elections. And in June this year, the Concord gave judgment and the following order. Leave to appeal was granted, and the appeal itself was upheld, and the order of the High Court was set aside. And it was declared that the Electoral Act is unconstitutional to the extent that it required adult citizens to be elected to the National Assembly and provincial legislatures only through their membership of political parties. Importantly, the declaration of unconstitutionality is prospective with effect from the date of the order, but its operation is suspended for 24 months to afford Parliament an opportunity to remedy the defects giving rise to the unconstitutionality. So this component of the order was critical because it served to protect the results of an election from attack, because it's prospective from the date of judgment. So it does not bring a situation of unlawfulness to the results that were declared in respect of the 2019 elections. So the prospective effect was quite important to protect the results, and therefore the resultant legislatures as well as the governments that have arisen from those parliaments. The Minister of Home Affairs, who was opposing the matter as well, was asked to pay cost of that appeal, the cost of the appeal in the Constitutional Court. But what was the court's rationale in arriving at the decisions it did? At the very beginning, the court did say that the matter was one of interpretation. In other words, the court was giving meaning to the words that are used in the Bill of Rights. And once they had established the meaning of those words, then to juxtapose the practical manifestation of that interpretation to the electoral system as we had it in the Electoral Act. So the whole exercise involved the judiciary's role of interpreting the constitutional text, and in particular, Schedule 2 of our Constitution, which is the Bill of Rights. And in that regard, the court made the following pronouncements. That Section 19(3)(b), which is the right to stand for office and if elected to hold office, is part of closely related right that the Constitution deliberately groups together as political rights. So the whole of Section 19 deals with what the court said were political rights, and those must be seen together as a family of rights. For instance, rights in Section 19(1) do not concern political parties only. And Section 19(1) is the right to form a political party, to canvass for a political party, to register a political party, and so on. So the court said all these rights must be seen together as a family of political rights. And it says that on a conscious choice not to form or join a political party is as much a political choice as is the choice to form or to join a political party. So the choice not to join a political party is as much of a political right as is the choice to form or join a political party. And therefore the choice not to join a party or form a party is equally deserving of judicial protection. I think this was really the nub of the argument, really, or rather the determination of the court that the right to form a political party has a corresponding right not to form or join a political party. And both dimensions of the right, the positive dimension as well as the negative dimension of the right, deserved judicial protection. So forcing an adult citizen to exercise the Section 19(3)(b) right through a political party deprives them of the choice guaranteed by Section 19(1) right, which is the right to join or to form a political party, with a corresponding right not to join or form a political party. So forcing a person to exercise their right through a political party negates the right not to join or form a political party. Then the court went further to say, not only does the Electoral Act infringes on the right to join or not to join a political party, it also negates the right to freedom of association. And the court said a full meaning of the right to freedom of association must be seen in dual forms. In the positive form, have a right to membership of any association which is lawful, but conversely, you have a right not to form an association. And both the negative and positive dimensions of the rights deserve judicial protection. So a restraint on the choice not to associate at all is a negation of the right to freedom of association. And if citizens can only contest via political parties, inherent in that is a denial of their right to freedom of not associating. So then the court went on to say that the founding provisions, which speak about a voter's role, regular election, a multi-party system of government, and so on, does not exclude participation of independents in regular elections. All that it does is to stipulate that the Republic must never be a one-party state. So the impulse that you find throughout the constitutional text, where it says that multipartism, what in fact that refers to is that the Republic must never again be a one-party state. And that can never mean the exclusion of independent candidates.
Sai, I think we have 2-3 more minutes for your presentation.
2 or 3 more minutes. Okay. Now, some reflections on this judgment. Obviously, this judgment does not implicate local government's electoral system, because in local government, we have a mixed member proportional system. And as I have indicated, the order is prospective and has no bearing on previous elections. Not all parts of the electoral court of the Electoral Act were implicated. Nomination of candidates, ballot paper design, and all other logistical arrangements which are regulated in the Electoral Act are not affected by the judgment. The judgment is only concerned itself with the electoral system. And the court did say that the constitutional imperative for elections to result in general in proportional representation is retained. So in other words, you could still have an electoral system that results in general in proportional representation, even with the inclusion of independent candidates. So all options are possible, subject to any electoral system resulting in some kind of proportionality. Now, just in conclusion, the Commission obviously has a material interest in how Parliament is going to be dealing with this matter. And there are 4 guiding principles that we think would have to be at play in the process in which Parliament engages to eventually come to an electoral system. Firstly, is that the electoral system must be fair. And that implies that every eligible voter should have the opportunity to vote, and that vote should be of equal value. So that's one of the fundamental values that we believe should be embraced by the process that is to be undertaken henceforth. Secondly is the value of simplicity, and that demands that the electoral scheme has to be accessible practically to every voter, easy to understand, and easy to participate in. Thirdly, the electoral system has to have the value of inclusiveness, and that implies that every attempt should be made to allow the widest possible degree of participation by various and diverse political preferences. And lastly, is the value of accountability. Public discourse in South Africa tended to elevate and place primacy on accountability as a key measure of an electoral system. It is accepted that the electoral system may encourage but cannot ensure accountability to the electorate. Accountability has to do with political culture in society. So these are the values that we as the Commission believe must shape any electoral system that Parliament will eventually adopt. Thank you very much, moderator, for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Sai. That was very, very useful. And I think you pointed out something, very clear in terms of the difference between the court judgment in Malawi and the one in South Africa, in terms of just being an issue of interpreting, the political rights as enshrined in the Constitution. But it's also interesting to see that the process in Malawi as well had implications around the questions of the 50% plus one in determining the outcome of the presidential election. I don't know if you'll be able to stay on, but we'll move on to we'll move on to the next presenters who are taking us back to Malawi. I'll just like to remind everyone that you should please use the chat function to type in your questions so that we can also start compiling those rather than wait for everyone to speak during the discussion segment. Next, I would like to introduce the chairperson of the Malawi Electoral Commission. As Advocate Chipuya had mentioned, that he's quite new, and the ECF is really looking forward to engaging with him in person. So the next speaker is Justice Dr. Chifundo Kachale, and he's the newly elected chairperson of the Malawi Electoral Commission. He had the great work of conducting an election within a very, very, very short time frame. Justice Kachale, you have the floor.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's great to be given this opportunity, and I'll just ride upon the protocols that already been observed by the other speakers. I think in order to just make the best use of the available time, but also belaboring under the challenge of having these two very important decisions being discussed in one presentation, I really find that quite a huge chunk of information to process. So I'll try to just focus on the jurisprudential and constitutional dynamics of the court decision in Malawi and how that operated. In order to save time, I'll just basically be very boring and read through my notes to try and capture everything within the time available. The lessons I think that for me stand out from a jurisprudential and constitutional perspective, firstly, are that the EMB is as integral to democracy as a midwife is to safe motherhood. So democracy can easily be threatened where an EMB exercises its mandate in a manner that lacks legal validity and popular legitimacy. So EMBs are an indispensable part and parcel of a democratic society, and their mandate cannot be taken lightly. Secondly, constitutionalism demands cultural transformation in order to deliver democratically acceptable outcomes. So the judicial process is an indispensable tool for enforcing constitutional standards of lawful government created through acceptable popular democratic mandate. An election is not just an event that you do and then you tick a box and move on. It must be conducted within a certain context that will actually enjoy the confidence of the people who are the foundation of democracy, and that is very critical. And to be able to do that kind of election, the people playing in that process must change their attitudes to how they look at the electoral process. Thirdly, I think the other critical lesson is that democracy requires a commitment to play by the rules from all stakeholders. So EMBs must run polls with strict adherence to the applicable laws, and the contestants and the public should seek to vindicate their interests through the legal mechanisms. So in like some areas said from Malawi, the Malawi Electoral Commission did make some modifications to some of the processes in the elections with the participation of the key stakeholders. So for issue of having constituency tally centers was signed on by all the political parties. They thought it's a very good logistical arrangement to aggregate the results at that level before taking them to the National Tally Center. But the court said whatever arrangements you made must comply with the law. When the people were not happy with the outcome, apart from taking the matter to the courts, which is a right that the individual contestants have under our law, the voting public took to the streets under their right to demonstrate on the streets. So everybody sort of used the law to push their agenda, and everybody was required to comply to the law in order to create the kind of outcome that everybody would be happy with. Which leads me to the fourth point about vigilance and responsiveness. I think vigilance and responsiveness are important attributes of a democratic society. So vigilance to insist on what's deemed to be correct by the affected parties, and responsiveness of the EMB to deliver on what society demands. So the EMB has no option to say, no, what we think what we did was correct and therefore you must live with it. The EMB, once the courts made a determination, was duty-bound to respond to that determination and arrange a fresh poll that would actually enjoy the confidence of the citizens. Number 5, democracy works well when the vote is given the weight and value that it deserves as the expression of the will of the governed on the choice of their rulers. So voting is more than about casting a piece of paper, whatever method you use. Voting is an expression of the value of a citizen in his own affairs of state. Every vote, whether it's an illiterate voting, whether it's a professor voting, whether it's a judge voting, the value of the vote isn't dependent on your social status. The value of the vote arises from the fact that you're a citizen of that community, and that gives you certain privileges and certain rights that people must properly account for. And I think as EMBs, we should take our responsibility to ensure that the vote counts as a democratic expression of very important stakeholders in the process of democracy. Number 6, I would say EMBs should operate free of the crippling political interests of the political contestants. So EMBs should not be beholden to the interests of the elites. I think the voter as a citizen should be accorded democratic opportunity he's entitled to as of right. As an EMB, we don't need the permission of the elites to arrange an election. Our duty is to the voter to give them the opportunity to choose who they want to run their governments. And we occupy a very unique position in that we are the only institution that can give the voter that opportunity based on the regular calendar that the law would establish. If we forget the voter as a critical stakeholder in the democratic project, we can easily get distracted by some of the vested interests by the ruling class who may have their own agenda as to why they may not want to have elections. Number 7, I would say do right by your citizens, not because of foreign observation reports or missions. the reason we must conduct credible elections is not because we want to have a good rating from a foreign observer. A good and credible election is important because the citizen deserves the right to have an opportunity to elect their leaders. The observation is a reflection on how people judge whether we are doing that in compliance with the international best practices and the legal obligations that we, as community of states, ascribe to operating within a democratic context. So we should never confuse the role of observation reports. They don't determine our key constituency. Our key constituency are the voters. And we as EMBs are accountable to those people. We owe those people the duty to do the right thing. When we do that right thing, the reporting is secondary, if not even tertiary. Next, elections may need to be conducted in less than ideal situations. As some already alluded to, we had to do elections in the context of the COVID-19, in the context where a new election EMB had just been put in place. So EMBs must appreciate their role and proceed with advice. In our context, we did engage the relevant public health authorities, and they assured us that what we were doing was adequate to proceed. But I think that also reflects another element. As EMBs, we must recognize where our mandate ends. We're not responsible for enforcing public health standards. If the political actors go out and conduct their meeting in defiance of public health standards, they are public institutions responsible for that. If we take on too many responsibilities and create the perception that because those activities are happening in the context of elections, then they are all our mandate, we set ourselves up for failure. They are public institutions in a democratic context that can handle every situation. And if indeed the public health crisis warrants a lockdown, or it has been deemed to be to warrant a state of disaster or a state of emergency, the constitutional mechanisms are in place. That mandate is not an EMB mandate. There are constitutional mechanisms in place that can democratically be engaged to determine whether it is safe enough to undertake that activity or not. Those are not EMB responsibilities. They are responsibilities that lie outside us, and nobody should hide behind us to try and run away from their constitutional mandate. The next one, I would say, the responsibility of the EMB in creating stakeholder confidence is critical. You know, we're not an institution responsible for adherence to rules and standards alone, but those standards are what people must understand, which leads me to the next point. They're almost related, which is about information sharing. Information sharing is vital to cultivate trust in the work of the EMB. When we got into office, basically less than 13 days to the elections, we found that our predecessors in office had done a lot of groundwork, but that information was not in the public space. And therefore, people were doubtful whether the old Malawi Electoral Commission were committed to obeying the court order. And yet, behind closed doors, they had done so many things that made it possible for us to deliver on our mandates, but there was no information sharing. So we undertook intentionally to issue regular press statements on all the key decisions we took. We engaged all the key stakeholders on some of the sensitive issues to preempt any contest at the end of the day. But as public institutions, I think we must not operate like we're running some secret societies or our activities somehow are beyond public scrutiny. We must be prepared to put information out there, because if people have confidence in what we're doing, they're more likely to accept the outcome of what we do. The next 2 points as I close is the issue of cost of running the elections again. Like Dr. Augustine observed, the development partners stood back. And our approach as Malawi Electoral Commission is that the cost of reruns is a premium for democratic peace. You know, it's an investment to building enduring societies. We cannot withhold conducting an election under the pretext that it will cost too much. Because if anybody thinks democracy is costly, they should examine the record on what the alternative costs. If you don't have legitimate government in place and there is a breakdown of law and order, the cost cannot be compared to what you invest in running a process that enjoys the confidence of the people and that creates legitimacy in the government. Finally, I think for me, from a jurisprudential perspective, this is even, I would say, the most important takeaway from the whole process, is that jurisprudence is as critical as legislation to entrench stronger democratic modes of government. The issue of 50+1, Malawi has had this conversation for over 20 years, whether we're going to use the simple majority or the 50%+1. Now that has got a demographic context. Our ethnic distribution, the demographics of our country are such that certain ethnicities command adequate majorities, so that as the way the political parties are organized, if you go by the simple majority arrangement, they don't need to cooperate with anybody else. They may have a small majority, but they will remain in power, and they don't feel the democratic need to have inclusive political platforms. The 50+1 arrangement totally transforms that situation. Nobody ethnically has the numbers to get into power by 50+1 without being more inclusive. And I think in terms of building and ensuring democracy, that's very important. So whereas the law has failed to do that through parliament, because like Augustine said, the law was retained and there's a whole history of many attempted reforms, the courts have come in and by judicial interpretation reminded the nation that we want governments that are politically accountable to the people in an inclusive fashion, not purely based on ethnic affiliation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Justice Kachale. And I think as you were speaking, you had also just tried to pick up on some of the questions coming up in the chat function. I will introduce the last speaker, last but certainly not the least. And he'll be speaking more as well on the court judgment in Malawi. I'm happy to introduce Dr. Sundu Madise, and he's the Dean of the Faculty of Law at the Malawi University. May I ask that as he also, starts to speak, he can also take a look at some of the questions in the chat function and try to pick up on them. There are already questions around the 50% +1 and all those issues. If you would like to speak about that as well, that would be useful. Thank you, Dr. Madise. Are you on? I don't see your video, but I see you're there. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. How much time do you give me since I'm the last one?
As well, you have 10 minutes, and if you permit me to just seek the permission of the chair, because we have now run out of time, if we can extend this by 15 minutes, at least to allow the panelists to respond to some of the questions before we round up, that would be great. Hilda and Advocate Chipuya, is that fine?
From our side, it's okay, but let me hear from the chair first.
Great, thank you.
Can I continue? So I will say that apart from being a dean at the Faculty of Law, I am also a commissioner of the Malawi Human Rights Commission. And in that capacity, I had the opportunity of us observing the elections from the tally center as well as in the various polling stations or polling booths. But maybe I'll start with the court judgment itself. And I'll start with the judgment in the High Court. So when the petition was taken by the petitioners and taken to court, there was a lot of divisions amongst Malawians. Others thought it would not go far, that the court would dismiss it. The court didn't, and then it essentially went back to an impanel panel of what we call the Constitutional Court Division, or in short, it's a Constitutional Court. But it's important that we distinguish this with the South African Constitutional Court, which is a higher court. The Constitutional Court in Malawi, in this case, is a high court, so it is lower than the Malawi Supreme Court of Appeal. Interestingly, this was one of the first cases, if not the very first case, if I'm not mistaken, no, maybe not the first case, in which the media was allowed to have the proceedings broadcast live. They were not allowed to broadcast video, but at least the audios. And I can tell you that the whole country, almost the whole country, was at a standstill. People followed the case. This case took almost 8 months. People would go to work or any other place that they usually congregate, listen to the radio, have debates amongst themselves. So they were able to follow the evidence. And it was interesting that local people without much legal knowledge were able to make their own analysis. And I can tell you, by the time we were having the judgment, the public had already made a judgment, which in most didn't deviate much from what the court eventually said. What was interesting in the High Court decision was that the petitioners succeeded in almost all the applications that they made. I can tell you that amongst the legal fraternity, the feeling we had was that, the court would essentially found the irregularities, but do what most courts have done in the region, still uphold the election. Essentially to say, there were irregularities, and because even under our law, it's not easy to nullify an election and order a rerun. But one must applaud the brevity of the court, that they did find that there were serious enough irregularities that would order a rerun. It's interesting that at that point, everyone seemed to have given the court a chance to come up with a decision. But the moment the court ordered a rerun and nullified the elections, then the narrative changed. So you had a narrative that was being perpetuated by those who were in power then, so essentially the party of President Mutharika, and then they started castigating the court and the judges, and essentially accusing the judges of a coup. In fact, the language that was used was a judicial coup. And I think, as Augustine has said, it also brought to the fore the discussion about the judicialization of politics, or maybe the politicization of the judiciary, depending on where you're standing. But yes, our judiciary faced a lot of scrutiny, a lot of things were said. In fact, the ruling party, we call it a ruling party, although we don't have a ruling party in Malawi because we have an executive presidency system. But the ruling party, the party of the president, even went on a demonstration. They demonstrated in the major cities of the country, essentially having placards accusing the judges of all sorts of things, including bribes. So these were serious attacks on the judiciary. And they seemed to have, including the former president, seemed to have put all his hopes on the Supreme Court, essentially saying that the Supreme Court would reverse the injury or the injustice that had happened. I do recall he used a particular word, a phrase. He said it was the death of democracy. So it was quite interesting time, especially in the legal profession. But going to the Supreme Court, there was also a feeling that maybe the Supreme Court would take the middle ground and essentially uphold the nullification. But there was fear that what the High Court has also done, which was to order that the definition of majority must be 50% plus one, and the Justice Dr. Kachari has ably explained why that is important, and that even amongst the legal fraternity, we've always thought that was the interpretation, only that the court, I think in 1999, did make an interpretation that was to the contrary. So the feeling was maybe the Supreme Court would uphold the rerun, but order that the majority should be a simple majority or first past the post, as we have been having in the past. So for the Supreme Court to throw away all the grounds of appeal was something that was welcome, but also the Supreme Court did clarify on issues to deal with, for example, when exactly the rerun should be done, and also on the issue of voting. Now, this is something that was troubling Malawians, because when the rerun was ordered, there was fresh registration. So there was a verification of those who had already registered. I do recall I went to have my details checked. But there was also registration of new voters. And that's where problems started, because children, some as young as 14, 13, were being seen to be registering. I don't know if that was the reason that the Supreme Court ordered that only the 2019 law should be used, the voters' law should be used. I would assume that the Supreme Court did take judicial notice of the fact that it was now common knowledge that young children who are not 18 yet who are not voting age were being registered for purposes of the election. That was the allegation, at least. Of course, the danger with that is that then you destroy the integrity of the national registration system, because you now have children who are being registered as being 4 or 5 years their normal age, and that card is likely to stay with them until they die. So the Supreme Court ordered that only the people who had registered for the 2019 election should vote, which in a way makes sense, because if it was a rerun, then the assumption was that we never had an election in 2019 anyway. And yet the Supreme Court gave the Electoral Commission a very short time to conduct the election. And the Supreme Court also said, which I would agree with, that to them, the 150 days that were ordered by the High Court was too much. And the Supreme Court was of the view that electoral disputes must be resolved within the shortest time that is possible. And then they said, according to them, they should have ordered nothing more than 60 days. But the Supreme Court upheld the High Court's position, but made it very clear that by the 151st day, we must have a president sworn in, meaning that the Electoral Commission now had a lot of work, or its work cut out, to ensure that it ensured that we had an election at least by the 23rd of June. And we did have that election on the 23rd of June. Maybe I'll talk about that later if questions arise. Unfortunately, we have the chairperson of the Electoral Commission here, and so it's not like I'm trying to praise him in his face, but I would say that it's the first time we've had an Electoral Commission that has delivered on its mandate within such a short period, and they did a professional job. I was there at the talent center. I went around, at least in the southern region of Malawi, in the polling stations, and you could see the professionalism that the Electoral Commission was doing it. Meaning, the Electoral Commission as a body has always had its professionalism, but maybe we had issues of leadership. I don't want to go into the details of the past commissioners, but I would say that it would be amiss of me not to commend the leadership of Justice Dr. Kachale and his fellow commissioners. The other thing he has also done is that he has demystified the chairperson of the Electoral Commission. He was able to talk to people. He was able to tell us his problems, the problems of the commission, their successes, and that in a way, I think, endeared the Electoral Commission with the Malawians. When he started, he said that he knew that there were problems, there was loss of trust, but I can say without fear of favor of contradiction that by the time we had the election, I think Malawians had restored their trust in the Electoral Commission. I think my 10 minutes is up, so let me stop there and wait for questions. Thank you.
very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Mandisi. We are really pressed for time, but I think some of the questions have already been posted on the chat, and I'll just read it out quickly. If any of the panelists want to talk about it, there was a question of the 50% plus one, and the provisions of the electoral law in Malawi. What does this mean? Does it mean that the courts changed the system midway? And does this mean that the electoral laws need to be, amended? There's a question of if the electoral observer missions had accepted it, and now you had the judiciary canceling the elections. What does this say overall? There was a question to the CEO of NEC asking about the steps taken by MEC to sanitize or disinfect the public facilities that were used during the elections. I think those are the main issues that I have I've picked from the chat, and I would like to open this up. I mean, we don't really have much time for everyone to raise their hands and speak, but we were told that the SADC Electoral Advisory Council may want to make comments, and I don't know if the representative, that is Justice Duarte, if she would like to make any comments in this regard. Otherwise, we are happy to just take comments from the floor. One way, which I would prefer, is for everybody to type in their comments so that we don't have to take representation of, of different issues. Hilda, is just Duarte making any comments?
I'm not sure if she's part of the meeting.
Hilda, we can't hear you.
Hello, can you?
Hilda, we can't hear you. Maybe you need to refresh your tab. And in the meantime, if we have any other person that wants to speak, you could please press the request to speak button and I'll see you on the list. Otherwise, whilst you do that, may I ask the chair or the CEO of Malawi to talk about steps taken to disinfect, and then the question of what does the first past the post requirement and the 50+1 requirement mean for electoral justice in Malawi. So maybe we address that question first before we go on to see if there are other questions. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. The issue of judiciary versus elections observers.
We can't hear you as well.
Are you sure it's not your? It's not your.
Yeah. Maybe it's.
I think it might be your issue, Olifonto, because I'm able to hear both Hilda and the chairperson.
Chairperson, we can't hear you. Your mic is unmuted, but
Olifonto, can you hear us? I think the problem is from you.
Can you refresh your page?
Yes, Wizo.
I said,
can I proceed?
Can you refresh your page?
I can't hear you, Wizo.
We can hear you well.
She can't hear anybody.
Okay, I'll send you a message. Please, Justice, carry on. I'll send you a message to Olifanto to refresh her page.
Hello.
Thank you so much.
Okay, Doctor, we can hear the chair now.
Thank you very much. I think I'll start with the question about the judiciary and the elections observers. The elections observers seem to have given endorsed the outcome, and the courts found that there was irregularities. To me, I don't see any problem with that. I imagine the elections observers are exercising their mandate under the law, and their mandate is observation, and according to what they observed, they're entitled to give their comments. The courts, on the other hand, are sitting in a situation where they're receiving evidence alleging certain issues which are established on the basis of an established legal process, and they determined that there were irregularities. I don't think the courts are bound by the commentaries of the observers in that outcome. And the courts have a unique mandate, different to observers. And I think in a democracy, we must respect that different people can have different perspective on the same issue, and they have a different responsibility on how they address that. The courts are the ones the law has empowered to determine whether or not to uphold the outcome. And I think the courts, in this manner, in this context, exercise their mandates appropriately. I think the observers acted within their mandate as well, and they would have their own issues to resolve internally as to how thorough their methodologies might be, or what challenges they might have omitted. I am not competent to comment on that without seeing the full reports and the context in which they raised their comments. On the issue of 50+1%, the courts are not changing the rules in mid-course. The courts are saying the rules that should have applied in this context are that the winner should have been declared on the basis of 50%+1. And in doing that, the courts do something very radical in the context of judicial activism, because they go back to their own previous jurisprudence, and actually interrogating that jurisprudence, they find that maybe the analysis at that level in 1999, when they said first past the post is adequate, was not thorough enough and missed some issues, which to me, like I said, shows me the value of jurisprudence over the legislation. Because in the context of jurisprudence, you have specialists who are addressing their minds in a very sober context on this very critical issue, who are able to move the nation forward on a matter that seemed like everybody agreed was the right thing to do, but somehow because of different political dynamics in the parliament or at cabinet level, certain recommendations which have been coming through on several occasions were never seeing the light of the day. So I don't think the courts were doing anything radical in that regard. The courts were remedying democratic deficiencies in our system, because it's a democracy. A democracy is a working process. I don't believe any democracy can claim that they work perfectly and they require no refinement. So I think the courts sit in a very unique place where they can be part of the process of democratic engineering to ensure that whatever systems we have in place serve the democratic needs of their people. I think if Sam is around, I'll allow him to speak on the issues of public COVID-19 measures that we took. But just to underscore the point that, yes, we try to ensure that all our staff had PPEs, we provided sanitizers, we provided hand-washing facilities, we ensured that we trained marshals to ensure that the queuing at the polling stations was socially distant compliant. We put out some regulations and rules or codes of conduct for the political parties in conducting their parties. But those ones we had limitation in terms of enforcement, but we could only try to enforce the things that were happening at our polling centers, and we don't want to create a false impression like everything worked perfectly. It wasn't a fully compliant situation, but our position as a commission was that the public health crisis could not be used to underestimate the democratic governance crisis we are also facing. Because some of the measures, like Sam earlier said, some of the measures which the authorities were seeking to put in place in the context of COVID-19 were suffering from public acceptance because they were being perceived as efforts to undermine the democratic process. So without the elections, even legitimate public health interventions were not being well received, and therefore lacking the impact they should have in that regard. I don't know if Sam would like to add anything.
Thank you very much. My chairman has said it all, but I think one thing I just need to add with regard to disinfecting the public facilities that were used during the electoral process. The answer is no, we did not disinfect, or the health authorities did not disinfect. In Malawi, most of our polling stations are schools. Fortunately, when we were conducting this electoral process, all the schools in Malawi were closed because of the COVID-19. This was one of the preventive measures. So I think that's why there was no need to disinfect after the use by the Electoral Commission because they were not used anyway. The schools had been closed way back, and they are just about to be opened now, a few months after the elections. Thank you so much.
Thank you. There was one other question that came up, and it's about the level of influence that the three different arms of government seem to have on the Electoral Commission. So you had the executive in terms of the powers to appoint, you had the legislature in terms of changing the rules, passing the laws, then you had the judiciary also interpreting the laws, and all three seemed to have an impact on the work of the Electoral Commission. So there was a question about what would be considered as best practice in terms of the accountability chain for the Electoral Commission. I see the IEC South Africa has left. Would have been useful to hear from them, their views around questions of the electoral system. But I would want Augustine, who had asked to respond to the question of the international observers, if he said he wanted to respond to that before we come. And I would also like to hear from Advocate as the chair of the ECF executive, best practice in terms of the role of the different arms of government with the independence of electoral commissions. Augustine, please.
Thank you very much, Alfonso. I think the larger part has already been addressed by Justice Kachali, but maybe just to add one thing, that what happened in Malawi and also, of course, what happened in Kenya a couple of years ago is a clarion call with respect to what constitutes election observation in this particular regard. And I think it's an area which requires further interrogation and further conversation, because it raises the question, what are the bases upon which we make a determination as election observers as to what constitutes a free, fair, credible electoral process? And I think what we see now is really the need to reconsider how we support election observation. And probably the conversation now is going into, to what extent must we also invest in domestic election observation, including the role of political party agents? Because I think one area that I think we have observed in Malawi is that when you capacitate political party agents to monitor the elections, and when they have that capacity to monitor to the point of vigilantism, I think the political parties themselves have the necessary trust in the process that they can identify with. And I think this is an area where we need to also be looking at, because at the end of the day, what you have in international election observation is really as someone who has a thermometer, checks the temperature. You can tell the temperature, but what you cannot pretty much tell is what has led to this, the internal dynamics which require a much closer introspection, which oftentimes, of course, international election observer missions do have limitations in terms of the extent to which they can go in depth. And even at the time they have to cut off the missions, this is the time that the critical part of the process actually starts.
Yeah. Thanks, Augustine. I think you raised a critical point about timing, but I think beyond timing as well, it's also the need for EMBs, to sit with observer bodies to interrogate questions around methodology and how can observers gain more access to certain parts of the electoral process. I was an observer in Malawi last year, and I have my sense about how much access observers had to the results processing system, and it was the same in Kenya. I don't know if Advocate would like to say something in terms of the independence of electoral commissions and the role of the different arms of the government.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you very much for all the very eloquent presentations. It's a very pertinent issue, and I think this is an issue that even we as at ECF have been considering. To what extent can we make observer missions more relevant At the level of ECF, we are really a body that does peer review observation, which differs from the other traditional observer missions. So the emphasis with the ECF-SADC is to look at the electoral management body. And I think this is one issue that we have raised, that it might be important for us to internally discuss as EMBs to what extent are we going to allow access to certain sections, specifically the results part of the election. And that is because we have seen more and more that observer missions, they only have access to a certain part of the process, and then thereafter, when it comes to the results sections, then we realize that they may declare an election, that the process has been free, it has been fair, but then they have not had any access to the aspects of results. And that might be an area which we as EMBs can really interrogate to see to what extent are we willing to allow one another to peer review other areas of our systems, in particular the result systems. Because that's where you have a situation where the result, the observer reports may not necessarily then give a reflective picture to what is the later outcome. And it seems that there is contradiction with future observations of the outcome of the elections. So I think that is a very important area that we as ECF need to interrogate with also with our partners. With regard to the different areas of the legislature, the executive, the judiciary, I think we are all aware that the separation of powers is a very important aspect of the rule of law. We are all aware that all these arms need to have their own separation of powers, and those electoral management bodies that have independence, constitutional independence, should really be seen to be fully independent of any of the arms, of these arms, the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. So I think it's very important that the electoral management bodies, we have our own unique role to protect the constitutional democracy of the countries that we are in. And it is very important that as electoral management bodies, we should be able to protect the independence of the electoral commissions without fear or favor. And I think it's quite disturbing that it is becoming more and more seen in the region and in other areas, such as Kenya and so forth, that you see this continual attack on electoral management bodies, where the electoral management bodies are trying as best as they can within their mandates to fulfill the mandate constitutionally or legislative mandate that they have been given, but are increasingly under attack and are increasingly being also forced out of office, often without due process. I know that was the case in Kenya. They were forced out without due process being followed. So I think this is an area where we need to really see how electoral management bodies can be protected. I think they also need to be protected. The independence of the electoral management bodies needs to be protected. And electoral management bodies should be able to fulfill their mandates without fear. Because of course, civil society, every arm has an important role to play. But I think there has to be a very clear balance. And I think we need to really see how these different stakeholders can work together and also ensure that the independence of the Electoral Commission is being protected. So that is very, very, very key, that we need to protect the independence of electoral management bodies. And I think every arm, the legislature has the responsibility to legislate. And it has the responsibility to legislate when there is reform that is required in electoral laws, whether it be in electoral laws or constitutionally. I think they have the mandate to follow through with those reforms. And there should be widespread consultation throughout, the countries, and all parties should have the opportunity to actually perform and be part of that legislative reform. So all voices need to be heard. I think it's very critical that as far as possible, legislative reform should be conducted through full public outreach, and all public participants should have the right to air their voices as to what legislative reform should be brought about. And this legislative reform should be brought about, I believe, really through the legislature. That is the role of the legislature. The judiciary, of course, holds a very important role, and they are there to uphold the rule of law, to interpret the laws, the constitutions, and the legislature, and legislation, and to ensure that the bodies that have the responsibilities, that they fulfill them and that they are accountable. So the judiciary has that very important role, and we all respect the judiciary, and we are also cognizant of the fact that all stakeholders must have the remedies at law whenever they are dissatisfied with any electoral process, that they have the remedies, that they can go to court and file whatever applications they want to file against any irregularities which they believe have taken place. So I think we just need to really strike that balance and to really ensure that that the legislature play their role within their role, and that there is no overreaching between the executive, between the legislature, between the judiciary, that there's no overreaching, that one arm is overreaching into the mandate of the other. I think this is very, very critical. This is very, very critical. I believe there are certain aspects which are very, very much the administrative mandate of the electoral management bodies. When it comes to registration, the different processes, nominations, etc., which are really the mandate of the electoral management body. And I think it's important that these administrative mandate and functions of the electoral management body, which are set aside in the laws, that it remains within the purview of the electoral management body, and that there's no overreach either by any other arm, whether it be the legislature, the judiciary, or the executive. So I believe this is really very important, that the electoral management body is also able to fulfill its functions without any overreach from any other arm of those three arms: the executive, the judiciary, and the legislature. But if legal reform has to take place, let it be done through proper structures. So thank you very much. I think that is basically all I would want to add. But to say that this is a very, very critical area, that there are so many important issues that have been brought up, which I think really need further broader discussion with a greater representation of all our electoral management bodies, and probably other also experts, that we can discuss this at a deeper level for the benefit of all of the SADC regions and even the continent. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chairperson. I can see Justice Kachale is itching to say something. But our interpreters, I believe they're almost signing off. So if we have just 1 minute, and then we'll take Justice Kachale for a last comment, and then we go to Hilda to do a summary of next steps. Thank you, Justice.
Thank you, Olofonta, for the opportunity. I just wanted to bring a perspective on systems and independence, which I think we need to take account of when you talk about democratization. My research in the work of the judiciary in Malawi, which I did for my work in postgraduate studies, taught me that systems are as strong as the people running them. So the constitution that the Constitutional Court of 2020 used to nullify the elections of 2019 is the same constitution that the High Court, sitting in 1999, used to uphold an equally flawed process. So I think, in my view, as we change systems, as we make new laws, we should never underestimate the value of instilling a social transformation culture, a democratic transformation culture. We must be intentional about creating a culture where society values democracy. If the judges, if the EMB practitioners are being victimized by the ruling elite and the society is sitting back and that they're not demanding more, we can have the most beautiful design systems on paper, but they'll never deliver on democracy. So for me, I think we should not underestimate the value of having a culture that values democracy, and that's a process. I think democracy is not an event. We don't just change the law on paper. We must create a culture where society demands more from how its affairs are being governed, and that takes a process. And I think Malawi is a perfect example of that, we had a perfect storm in a way where so many different factors were in place to deliver an outcome which nobody seemed to have expected. But I think we had the right parties in place, we had the right lawyers in place, we had the right judges in place, we had so many factors came together, not because of one event, but because of a process that's been going on for almost 3 decades of democratic transformation, which causes people to value democracy as a way of doing business. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Justice Kachale. I think you've really given us some food for thought. Hilda, as we round up. Oh dear. Looks like we lost Hilda. Okay. Technology is not Hilda's friend this afternoon. Okay, she's coming back.
Hello. Hello.
All right, great.
Yes.
Please.
Can you hear me? Thank you, Olufunto. I'm just going to give a summary, just the few points that we will take forward to the ECF in terms of the various structures, whether it's to the subcommittees, executive committee, and eventually to the annual general conference. Some of the issues that we are taking away are as follows. We note that we need to have more discussions on electoral systems reforms. There were a lot of issues that came up in relation to EMB independence, role of EMBs, protecting the electoral commissions. We also have some takeaways on EMB management of elections in crisis situations, something that is very important to commissions. We are also taking away a lot of issues in relation to election observation. We talked about methodologies. We talked about access to some of the electoral processes by observers. We even talked about the essence of election observation. Briefly, these are five areas that I have highlighted that came up from the presentations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hilda. We will have a report as well that gives a good summary of the key issues that we've discussed. It's always great to have these partnerships with the ECF. Once again, we would like to thank the leadership of the ECF-SADC for making this kinds of platforms available for EMBs to exchange information. We will compile the report and we'll definitely share this in terms of next steps. A word of thank you to all participants, all the electoral commissions that joined this webinar. We had very good representation from all the ECF members and the other technical partners as well. Thanks to all our speakers, Augustine, Sami, Justice Gachale, Dr. Madise. Very big thank you to you, and thanks to our team at International IDEA and the technical team at Kudu for making this possible and orderly. And should I thank the internet as well for working well for us today. Thank you all so much, and we will share the report with you. Thank you.
Yeah, Olifantu?
Yes, Weasel.
Yeah, I want to just add that the video recording will be available in Portuguese and in English, and we will be happy to share it with our honorable speakers and participants very soon.
Okay, thank you so much, Weasel. Very important.
You're very welcome, my dear. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.